So I'd like to give a little commentary on Owen Benjamin's steel manning of evolution. And just in case you are part of his community of bears, I am also part of that community. I'm speaking as a Patreon of Owen Benjamin's. But I would like to give a criticism of what he's doing. First of all, I don't like the term steel man, and I think we need to start a movement to get rid of that term. It's an IDW term. It never sat well with me. It seems very literal. It's very left hemisphere if you're thinking about Ian McGilchrist, The Master and His Emissary book. And I think what we need to do is move to something more figurative that still makes the point, and I think it makes the point better. Let's start calling it, instead of steel manning it, let's Iron Man it. So why should we do Iron Man as opposed to Steel Man? Because isn't, steel is stronger than iron, right? Well, it's not stronger than Iron Man. When we're talking about something less literal and more figurative, Iron Man is a hero. I'm not too much into the comic book series of Iron Man or the movie series that he's done. I've seen some of it, but I'm appreciative of the abilities he has. If you look it up, he has genius level intellect. So isn't that what you're trying to do when you're steel manning the other side's argument? You're not trying to make them dumb like a straw man. You're trying to make them as smart as they can be. So genius level intellect is part of Iron Man. I think that's a good part of trying to make the case for Iron Man versus a steel man. And he's a proficient scientist and engineer. I'm reading right from here. He has a powered armor suit. I think there's like laser beams shoot out of it in his chest and eyes and stuff, and his hands, from what I've seen in the movies. That's a lot more than a steel man can do. He has superhuman strength and let's see, durability, supersonic flight energy, repulsor and missile projection, regenerative life support. Okay, all of that is good stuff. All of that is superior to a steel man. And if you look up steel man, here's what you get. Is this really what you want to turn your enemy's argument into? Is this steel man? I think not. So let's try to make the argument into an Iron Man instead of a steel man. So I'm going to have Owen introduce his video here, and then I'm going to produce some further commentary on it.
Big Bear slipped off into his little piano thought room here, and I'm going to steel man evolution. This wasn't my idea. Someone else said it on the comment section, because I did this. I used to talk about on stage, if you can't argue the other side, you have no right to that opinion. And I did this whole video about that, about how I wanted political people to argue the other person's side. And that way people can really figure out what is the best answer for America. Turns out.
And that's a noble pursuit. I agree with him there. And as a side note, I think I said that steel man was an IDW term. I think it was brought up by Eric Weinstein in the IDW, but it might not have originated there. But it's certainly part of Eric Weinstein trying to popularize this idea. And of course, in philosophy, you're always taught to avoid straw manning someone's arguments. So, but I don't know if exactly the term steel man is popularized in philosophy. In my classes, I never heard of steel manning. I only heard of straw manning when I was a philosophy major.
Doubt liberals never would participate because I think they know they're wrong. So today I'm going to steel man evolution. I'm going to argue in favor of evolution and how it was presented to me. Bear in mind, I minored in evolution for a bit in college. I actually know a decent amount about it, and I used to want to be a paleontologist when I was a kid.
Now, similarly, while I was a philosophy major, I minored in anthropology, and evolution was a big part of that, and I took a class specifically on human evolution. So when I critique Owen here, I'm going to critique him as a non-scientist, as a common person. So I'm not going to be using jargon. I'm not going to be using stuff from I'm not going to get into the weeds, so to speak, of the details of evolution. I'm going to speak broadly, I'm going to speak generally, and I'm going to speak as a common person would speak about science. And I'm going to cut Owen a lot of slack, as I would like people to cut me a lot of slack. So I'm going to treat Owen as I would like to be treated, and I'm not going to dig in, and I'm not going to bring out daggers or anything. I'm very sympathetic to Owen and his cause, and that's why I'm making this video, because I am sympathetic to his cause, and I want his community to get the best they can get from Owen. And personally, I just don't think this video was the best Owen could have given his community. But again, I'm cutting him slack because he's just sitting down whenever he has free time. He has a young family, and he's trying to keep this channel going. So he's sitting down whenever he can find time to put out something for the Bears, and I appreciate everything he puts out. And I just want to add that I still appreciate all the effort he puts into giving us content while he's trying to raise and care for his young family.
And briefly, a marine biologist. I think every kid loves dinosaurs. Every boy likes dinosaurs, or most. I know my son does. Sorry if I sound a little choppy right now. I'm trying to figure out. So my parents were really cool in the sense that any interest I had, they would just pile me full of books and let me get a tutor or something, or figure out as much as I could about it. And so I got into paleontology and just science in general. I always loved, because there was an answer. And it turns out there isn't. Science requires as much faith as religion. I didn't learn that until I was older, though. And I think that's the big difference. And one of the big fallacies that people keep writing in the comment section, they're like, yeah, you believe in Sky Daddy Spaghetti Monster, but not science. And I'm like, no, see, what you don't understand, and you're doing this willfully. And I realize that people are doing it willfully. They know better, but they still do it because they're weak. Religion requires faith, and no one isn't saying that. That's why it's called faith in God.
So this is a very interesting point he's bringing up, and I wholeheartedly agree. And the idea is this, that you have this, on the one hand, you want to believe things that have evidence supporting them. You want to have justified beliefs philosophically, rationally. You want to have beliefs based on evidence. But there's also another part to that, and it's the trusting part. So you have it's trust, it's about relationships, it's about love, and these are things that are sort of antithetical to the logic and the reason and the evidence-based, the fact-based knowing. There's fact-based knowing, and there's sort of a relational knowing. There's a love-based knowing. There's a people knowing. So, for example, if I bring out your license, this is, I thought of a pretty good example of the difference of knowledge here. On your license, there's a picture of you. Does the picture ever look anything like you? No. It's always a bad picture. You've always outgrown the picture. You've changed your hairstyle. You've changed the way, maybe you lost weight or you gained weight, whatever. Then there's your height is listed, for example, on your license. So this is a number, and this is a number that describes you as a person, and this is fact-based knowledge. This is left hemisphere, if you're a fan of Ian McGilchrist. And so now your height actually changes between morning and night. So you're a little taller in the morning, and you're a little shorter when you go to bed at night. So even that is not really, you can't hang your hat on even those numbers on your license, and that's a fact-based knowledge. Where you live is listed on your license. You might have moved, So there's a good percentage of people out there. This has happened to me several times as I've moved over the years. I have a license that is not expired, but the address is not exactly correct on it because I have moved. So even that bit of knowledge, it's fact-based. It's printed on a little placard there, and it's wrong. So you can't know people just from a fact sheet. Knowing people requires a lot of other information, a lot of relational knowledge, and it's never going to come from numbers or pieces of paper or words written on a paper. It's only going to come from interacting with the person face to face, hopefully primarily, because so much of our communicative ability is nonverbal, And it is sort of visual, it's spatial, it's about touch and presence, and our gesticulation even is important to our communication. So this is what Owen is, part of what Owen is saying, is that there's a whole other side to this area of knowledge, that you people who hold science to be the primary form of knowledge, that's what scientism is, that science can answer every question, science is the be-all and end-all of everything. That's very incorrect. And so Owen's saying, look, you are actually believing in a story. It's just a different type of story than what I'm believing in. So you may relegate religion off into the storybooks, the fairy tales, but you are not acknowledging that your belief system is also part of the bookstore. It's also part of a story. It's also a fiction that man has come up with to lay order upon the world. And this is something I've been saying in many of my videos, and if you go back into my Fearful Symmetry series or my Missing Link series, it's one of the first videos I did, I was talking about this. And what's important to understand here regarding the refutations that the scientism people, or the accusations they may make towards Owen, where he says, oh, they're saying, I believe in the flying spaghetti monster, this, that. What science does, and this is brought up by Northrop Frye, science only proves the accidental in metaphor as being incorrect. It does not prove the ideal in metaphor as being correct. And if you've heard me talk about this before, I apologize, but I'm trying to aim this video at perhaps a new audience, maybe more of Owen Benjamin's audience. And so I'm going to explain this a little bit further. So, for example, we used to say, and we still say, sunset and sunrise. These are metaphors for describing what the sun is doing and what the sun, and so forth, and our relation to it. Science proved to us that the sun is not rising and it's not setting. This is just an accidental feature of that metaphor. But the ideal feature of the metaphor, what is actually occurring, that the day we have daytime and we have a nighttime, that's not proven wrong by those metaphors. And so what science does is it assumes an ideal perspective of the world and an accidental one. So by us being on the surface of the earth, and we have this metaphor describing the sun as sunrise and sunset, our place, our accidental perspective being on the earth, gives us this accidental aspect of the metaphor, the description of it. But if you look at it from an ideal perspective, let's say somewhere out in space, you can see that the sun is not rising and that the earth is rotating. Science proves only the accidental as wrong in the metaphor, not the ideal. And so when you're talking about the poetry of the Bible, or even some of the more flowery language of the Bible, a lot of the metaphor, the allegory, and so forth, science cannot touch those things in the ideal sense. They still have a deep meaning, and it's only the accidental aspects of those descriptions and those metaphors. Only the accidental are touched on by science and affected by scientific knowledge. So your deeply held beliefs are not really affected by what science has to say about the Bible. I'll let Owen go on here.
Faith. Science also requires faith. They just don't admit it. It's a secret religion. It's just as religious.
It's particularly religious these days regarding many dogmas that scientists have. Now, I have a few friends who are scientists, and they are in these email groups and listservs and stuff, and they don't go with the grain. Let's say they go against the grain. They are heterodox, and they cannot reveal themselves as such because they will be drummed right out of their careers. And so when you say that, oh, all the scientists agree with climate change, if you don't, you're in a lot of trouble. Anyway, I don't want to get into the climate change debate. There's a lot of nuances and intricacies there. But one of the things that Owen doesn't say, but I think lends itself to what he's saying, is that the story that scientists believe in, there's presuppositions that you have to hold in order to pursue science. And one of the presuppositions is that the world, the universe, is laid out in an orderly fashion, that there is order to be found, that there is a cause and there's an effect, and that these things are related. And without that presupposition that there's order, that there's cause and effect, and so forth, you're not going to pursue science. You're not going to think that anything like an experiment could tell you anything valuable about what's going on in the world. So the presuppositions that scientists hold are themselves not scientific. So if you hold to scientism that all your beliefs must be tested and proven by science, that belief itself is not scientific. That's philosophical. So there is a whole philosophy behind science that the common person who's a scientism believer doesn't quite understand, that they're holding to a philosophy, not to a science. And the philosophy is false. If it's true, it's false.
If not more, because their story changes all the time. But there's a leap of faith because they can't prove much. All right, so anyway, this is the story of evolution, and it's a story, and I'm going to try and describe it as best I can, and I'm not going to get too technical because A, I'm a little rusty, and B, it's just, I don't know. If you can't, whenever people say it's too complicated to explain, it means they're lying. So I'm just going to try and explain it as best I can. All right. In the beginning, there's primordial soup, and a lot of people have made the distinction that that's not evolution, that's something else, that's something Genesis or whatever, but that's not how it was explained to me. So life began in billions of years ago on Earth with amino acids clumping together, and they formed a single cell. And the single cell organisms, like amoebas and whatnot. Sorry, this thing is just really annoying going in and out of my ear. I'm just going to take this out. The single cell organism started, and then from there, there became multi-celled organisms. And the way evolution works is it's pressure from the environment. So if it's more advantageous to have a nose or have an ear, and there was a mutation to have a nose or an ear, that individual survived and procreated. So single cells, see, I can't even argue for evolution because it's so flawed. All right, I'll try my best. All right. So there were single cell organisms, and then there was a mutation. We're just out of nowhere, and this happens all the time. Cancer cells are mutations, right? So there is.
Now what you're seeing here is Owen's trying to explain stuff from memory because he had learned this in college, just like I learned it in college. And you can kind of sit down confidently, and again, he's limited in his time because, again, he has a young family, he just had a child. So he's trying to sit down and just bang this out. And he knows he did learn this in college and so forth. But then when you try to recall the details to explain what you learned and how you came to your decisions, it's much harder to sit down and explain the details. And I myself know this, where, in my pursuit of my channel here, where I learned something from reading a book and then I try to explain it to someone, it's much harder to explain it, even though I've grasped, what it is that I want to know. To try to convey that precisely to someone else is a much different task. And it's, of course, much, much harder if you've learned it 20 years ago and you're trying to recall the details now. And, of course, science does change over time. It updates itself, hopefully, towards a better understanding of how the world works, but not always, as we're seeing with all the controversies regarding the peer-reviewed journal entries. So Owen's trying to remember the details here, and again, I'm cutting him some slack because it's really hard to remember the details when you're just sitting down and trying to remember. He once learned the details, he made a judgment about it, and he knows his judgment he feels is correct, but now how can he explain the details of why it's correct? And what you're going to see here is that Owen repeatedly tries to do the explanation of evolution on a basic level. I don't think it's even a Steelman level, but he can't quite get it out, because I think, again, he's limited on time. He didn't do research, and he's trying to recall stuff he learned in college classes, 20 years ago or something.
There's a shift in the DNA and the RNA where just a new algorithm is formed randomly. This is all real, by the way. This does happen, but and from there, if that new mutation interacts with the environment better, there's a higher likelihood that they will have offspring that survive. And that's all survival of the fittest is. Fittest simply means offspring that survive. So there's single cell organisms that, and then out of nowhere comes a multicelled organism. And that multicelled organism grew and had little multicell organism children.
So a few minutes ago, Owen was trying to remember the term ambiogenesis, and that's the start of organic life, I think, from inorganic life. And I think that's what, again, I myself am trying to remember this from over a decade ago from my college classes. And now he's talking about, an upwelling of multicellular life. And so he could be referring to the Cambrian explosion, where there was a lot of variation kind of happening all at once in life, in the way life was developing. And I don't know if we've ever uncovered a reason for the Cambrian explosion. I think there's various theories as to why all of a sudden you would have a whole plethora of different types of life developing.
And then from there, billions of years passed. And that's one of the things that evolution argues, is with the vast amounts of time, our silly little brains can't fathom how much time passes and what can happen in that amount of time. So time keeps passing, and these multicelled organisms keep shifting and swaying, and the Earth's climate and continents with continental drift keep switching and shifting. At one time there was Pangea and Gondwana land is what it's also called, because when you give something a name like intellectual dark web, it becomes a thing, even though it isn't a thing. But I at one point there was, as you can see, like South America fits neatly into Africa, and at one point everything was together, and then it broke apart and went their own separate ways. But sorry, but I'm trying to keep their story straight.
So I think what he's trying to get at is this is important to evolution because it develops a separation of the gene pools. And so now you start to have different gene pools evolving differently, as opposed to them all being intermixed in one large pool. And this is important for evolution, and I think it has something to do with genetic drift or something like that. I'm gonna run through some of the important points a little bit later in the video, just so that if you're interested, you can look them up for yourself.
Okay, there was snowball Earth, where for millions of years the whole Earth was a snowball, and then photosynthesis came out of nothing, because eventually these.
Now he's sort of correct here in that we really don't know how photosynthesis works still, and it's an open question. Some people are theorizing that there is quantum effects or some kind of quantum mechanics going on in these plants, and some people argue against that. So there's still a lot of open questions regarding photosynthesis, and it's seemingly perhaps more complex than we initially thought it was. And again, I didn't realize this until I started looking into it and looking into exactly, how much we don't know. The more we seemingly know, the more we seemingly find out we don't know. And, that's a good thing. To realize your ignorance is a good thing.
Multi-celled organisms, there was a mutation of photosynthesis, so then everything became a plant. And then came the dinosaurs, just with unfathomable amount of time, just mutating and becoming things. And then when I was a kid and wanted to be a paleontologist, they said that the T-Rex was this big predator. And then they said, no, it turns out T-Rex was a scavenger. And then it turns out that they're more like chickens. And then not lizards at all. And then they're covered in feathers. This is all just in my lifetime. All right. So anyway, the environment chooses who survives and who doesn't. So if we look at whales, now something called vestigial body parts or appendages, kind of like the our appendix, is proof of evolution, where there's thigh bones in a whale. And that, of course, proves that at one point they were on land. And then because of adaptation to environment, the legs slowly withered away into fins. But it hasn't completed the process yet, so there's still thigh bones. You know, another proof of evolution is there are these moths that were white that would hide on white birch trees in Victorian England during the Industrial Revolution. So much soot covered the birch trees that the white moths would get picked off by crows. So the 1 in 100 black moth would survive and prosper, and then made a bunch of black moths, and then the moths turned black. The origin of life no one can understand in science or in evolution. There's a theory called transpermia, where little bits of life came to this planet from comets or asteroids. From where? No one knows. Okay, Eskimos are still dark-skinned, even though they live in an area where sexual selection and natural selection should make their skin lighter, because they eat a lot of bear liver, which is high in vitamin D, so they don't get rickets. All right, I hope I'm selling you guys on evolution. I know that the capital S scientist people will just, no matter what I say, there's no changing their minds. But I can't keep going with this. It's just so stupid. All right, there's different types of evolution. There's macro and there's micro, right? The macro is ridiculous. There's not only isn't there an argument, it sounds like just the rantings of madness. Microevolution, there is an argument for. Like, for example, the height of people in Scandinavia, you could argue it's to keep the organs away from permafrost. You know, the color of skin.
I think he's still talking about macroevolution there, but from what I understand, the microevolution is more about we can actually observe that in a lab regarding like viruses or something, and so on a small level, things that have a very short lifespan, we can see mutations develop, and we can we can even simulate that in computers too. But so you can see Owen can't really keep up trying to explain evolution. He kind of delves into the weak points of evolution, or at least the way he perceives it. And I think it's because he wants to tell the truth. He doesn't want to put up what he feels is a deception or a lie, which I think that's what he thinks, as he says, macroevolution is. He thinks it's ridiculous. He thinks it's madness. And he's going to go on to explain how it even has some sort of eugenics type of underpinnings, which I would really like to comment on. But if these videos run more than like 35 minutes for me, they become really troublesome to upload and process, and for YouTube it just takes a huge amount of time for some reason. It's not on my end either, because I have, my upload takes a few seconds and then YouTube just processes it for like an hour and a half. So I think I'm going to skip talking about what he says later on in the video, though I think it's very interesting, and there is some truth to it. Although I think there's sort of a murkiness about it as well, because on population, when speaking about populations, he brings up IQ and how winters in Europe sort of forced people to think ahead and to plan ahead, and so the people who could plan ahead well are the ones who ended up surviving the winters, and so that led to an increase in intelligence, and perhaps people who lived in more tropical environments where fruit is dropping from trees year round, they didn't have to plan ahead necessarily. Now, there are some details to that he brings up in previous podcasts, previous YouTube videos, where there are areas of the tropics where they have to deal with the rainy season or monsoon season, something like that. And in those areas, there is a noticeable spike in IQ versus the other surrounding areas of the tropics. So again, it could be an environmental factor that is pushing the evolution of the human brain to its limits in order to survive. I mean, it just so happens that those who have those abilities survived. There's no guidance to that. And so if you want to look up some of these terms yourself, I looked up, from what I could remember, there were 4 sort of fundamental mechanisms to evolution, and maybe there's more now, I don't know. But so here's, natural selection is one of them, genetic drift, I previously mentioned, mutations, which you probably know about, and gene flow. And then I guess someone said there's 5 mechanisms, and here it just talks about genetic drift occurs when population is small and isolated. So again, when everything started to, when the populations came out of Africa, if they did, there's also new speculation about that there might have been several sort of proto-human populations that developed simultaneously around the world. And when I was in college, the idea was that the modern humans were about 250,000 years old. But now in the news, it seems like, maybe it's much, much older than that. Maybe modern humans can go back 350, 450, 550, maybe 600,000 or 700,000 years from some of these new findings in archaeology. If you can't see the screen, I'll just read off some of the other things. Again, it's mutation, non-random mating, gene flow, the founder effect in genetic drift, the bottleneck effect in genetic drift, again, natural selection. So there's a lot of different things you can look up for yourself and see if you buy into it or believe in it. I think a lot of this stuff is actually true, despite what Owen might feel about it. But again, there's an open question to it. We can't exactly observe it, but there's a lot of indirect evidence. And I'm willing to go where the facts lead, and I have an open mind regarding evolution, whether it is or is not correct. If you want to hear some interesting arguments against evolution, and if you're a fan of Owen Benjamin, you might be predisposed to hear this, I would recommend looking up Darwin's Black Box by Dr. Behe. I believe that's his name, Behe. He came to my university when I was attending and gave a very entertaining lecture. The room was packed. I didn't even understand who he was, but I guess he was pretty famous in this field and pretty controversial. And this man, I mean, he seemed to know exactly what he was talking about. I believe his expertise is chemistry or biochemistry, and he wrote this book, Darwin's Black Box, and I believe he wrote several other books. And his main point is irreducible complexity. So he brings up the idea of a mousetrap, and sort of you can't ever have a mousetrap evolve because each part is sort of interdependent on the others for its function and existence. And so you sort of have to have a whole mousetrap to begin with. And now he brings that idea of irreducible complexity into all of our biology, and he tries to explain certain functions of our biology, certain mechanisms that sort of have to be complete. They have to be whole in order to function, and it can never evolve. It can never have one piece after the other, and so forth. And the odds of it developing all at once like that in an evolutionary way is just it's so much rarer than you might think, even in evolutionary terms, even over billions of years and so forth. Again, now what's interesting about Dr. Behe is that even if you don't believe in what he's saying, he does defend his beliefs. I believe to this day, decades later after I've seen him at the university, I believe he maintains a website, and I think he's continued publishing books, and I think he maintains an open discussion about his philosophy, and he refutes arguments. He takes arguments in and he gives his position back. So he's not one to wilt under pressure. If you like this idea, definitely look up Dr. B. He's constantly updating his work, and it's almost like apologetics. If you're into religion, it's almost like he's an apologist, and he's responding to different arguments from the scientific community on an ongoing basis. So that's my little commentary on Owen Benjamin's evolution of Steel Man, or the Steel Man for evolution. And like I said, let's make it Iron Man instead of Steel Man. And I hope some people from Owen's community watch this and share this. If you like this kind of video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel. Thanks.
Well, there's a guy who's got a little YouTube channel, and I've been sending a lot of people his way, Node in a Network, and he's basically been reading all of the stuff in the footnotes of Maps of Meaning,
where we're all sort of plugged in as like nodes on the network.
Node in a network, there's a good username.
A node in a network.
The wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network.